Hello, good day, dear students. Today, the topic for study and discussion is Introduction to Host-Parasite Relationship. This particular chapter is very much essential before we go in details of various diseases caused by microorganisms in particular. There are few terms, there are few understandings which are essential before we switch over to the various disease aspects of the microorganisms. Now, when we come to introduction to host-parasite relationship, this particular slide shows 6 chain together, linked by one another. And this represents the 6 stages how a disease cycle would take place. And it is essential to know for us how these disease cycles can be broken in order to stop the transmission of the disease, in order to stop the spread of disease. So this is what we are going to study today. And we will be studying it right from the beginning. First thing that you should know is there is a definite relationship between host, pathogen and their environment. As you can see here, a triangle is figured out in a slide, and this is known as disease triad. This disease triad has been shown in a form of a triangle. This triangle, as you know, has 3 corners called vertices. The pathogen, that is the causative agent, causes the disease. It causes the disease. So that is a pathogen. So that is what? Second, the host or the organism harboring the disease means the patient. It can be anybody, plant, animal, or human beings. And that is, we call it as a who. The next is this environment. Environment means either the surroundings or certain other factors which causes or allows the disease transmission. And that is what we call it as a where. So this is the what, this is who, and this is where. This makes 3 corners of a triangle. Now there is a definite relationship between the host and the pathogen, and it is in both the ways. Similarly, the pathogen also interacts with the other microbes, other microorganisms which are present in the host, and that is microbe interactions. So this is a disease triad, and this disease triad basically is to indicate that there is a relationship between host, pathogen and environment. Now let us come to the beginning of what, how, where, all those things. First is, what is infectious disease? Infectious disease is basically, in a simple term, can be explained as it is a battle over resources. How do you interpret this? Battle over resources. Whenever there is a battle between 2 countries or 2 individuals, it means there are 2 parties who are fighting with one another. Here we are taking it in a sense that one is a host and the second one is a pathogen. So the host is providing protection, nutrients and energy to the host himself, and in many cases to the pathogen too, when it is obligately intracellular parasite. Second, the pathogen. The pathogen basically should access and exploit the host. It means the pathogen should be able to go or establish itself in the host, should be able to obtain nourishment, should be able to grow, should be able to attain the energy as well as the protection. So pathogen must access and exploit the host. And in order to continue its survival, whose survival? Survival of the pathogen, the access should be found for a new host. It means pathogen should be able to access the new host from the existing host. It means that in order to survive, it should be able to transfer itself from the present host to the next host. Now, how does this host would react to it? When a pathogen is causing the penetration, colonization, use the nutrients, energy of the host, then what should the host do? Should host allow that pathogen to do all these things? The answer is no. So what should be the reaction of the host? The host must resist infections. It should resist. Resist means it should not allow the pathogen to do whatever it is doing it. So in short, you can say it is a kind of a battle over resources. Now, the relationship between these two parties, who are basically enemies, one is pathogen and the other one is host. It is a kind of a symbiotic interaction. What is meant by symbiotic? Symbiosis means living together. Remember, symbiosis in actual scientific language, it means living together. What will be the outcome? It can be injurious to one of the party or one of the individuals. It can be non-damaging to, or one of the parties can benefit while harming the other, or it can be one of the parties, one of the individuals would be gaining something without harming another ones, or it may happen that both the individuals, host as well as the pathogen, must be mutually gaining something. But whatever the outcome may be, when two individuals are living together, when two entities are living together, here I mean to say host and the pathogen, then that is known as symbiosis. Remember, symbiosis is many times used for, or it is many times mistaken for the condition where both the individuals are benefited. But scientifically, symbiosis means living together. Now, when we look what the parasite does, then parasite lives or on or within. Parasite lives either on the surface or within the host organism. Now remember, there are two organisms. One is pathogen and the other one is host. Remember, the organism does not mean always that we are talking about microorganisms. In a broader sense, every biological entity, every biological living thing is an organism. So here it is used in a sense that the parasite lives on means on the surface or inside or within, that is inside means within the host organism. Second, the parasite uses the host to achieve metabolic dependence. It means when the parasite grows on or within the host, it will naturally require nourishment, nutrients, or protection, which the host would be able to provide. So, it would use the host metabolic system. Means it would depend on the host for its further growth. Next is typically cause the disease in the host. It would, in most cases, or I would say in not most, but in few cases, it would lead to the development of disease. However, some parasitic interactions can be mutually be benefited. Like the normal flora present in our body, in the body of the host, is very much helpful to the host. It can be symbiotic or it can be commensalism, but it would, the presence of the organisms in intestinal tract like E. coli is beneficial. But in few cases, it would cause disease. Now, to whom will we call the host? Host is usually the larger organism that supports the survival and the growth of a smaller organism. So, smaller organism is a parasite and the larger organism is a host. Parasite would depend upon the host for its survival as well as for its growth. The term parasite used indicates certain small microscopic organisms like bacteria, viruses, fungi, and even protists. So, pathogen, when we use the word in particular, it can be one of these organisms, and the host is a human being. Host is a larger organism and the pathogen is a microscopic or submicroscopic organism. Now, we use these words which we are going to discuss. Next is infection and disease. So, what is infection? Are these words infection and disease same, or they have some different meaning? I would say, in a broader sense, in a layman's language, we use these words interchangeably, because many people would say that he has an infection of cold, influenza. Basically, what he wanted to convey was that he is suffering from a common cold. It's a disease. So, in a routine language, people use this word interchangeably to specify that there is some discomfort, there is some disease. However, there is a difference between the two. Infection is basically a process. And what is that process? It is a process where the organism grows and multiplies into the host, either on surface or inside the body. So you can say we all are infected at any given point of time. Even a healthy individual is infected. Everybody is infected with a normal flora, like presence of Escherichia coli in our intestinal tract, presence of various staphylococci on our skin and the body part, presence of various organisms which are existing as a normal flora in mouth. So in other words, every individual, even the child who has just been born, would be infected within few hours by the organisms which surrounds that individual. The world is full of microorganisms. They are omnipresent. So you cannot leave it in isolation. And therefore, every individual, we can say, is infected. So infection is a process. And what is the process? When an organism grows, multiplies in or on the host, it is known as infection. And the infectious disease, or simply disease, it is an outcome of that process. So what is the outcome? When we use the word disease, means when the infection, which we just discussed earlier, so when the infections detrimentally affects the host function or the body part, then that is known as disease. As far as these organisms are existing as a normal flora and they do not disturb the function or the structure of the body, fine, they are rather helpful. But if they cause any damage, if they cause any detrimental effects on the host, and that effects can be manifested by various signs and symptoms, so that outcome we will call that as a disease. So remember, students, that there is a difference, a clear difference as far as scientific considerations are concerned, that infection is one thing and the infection is a process, and the outcome of that process, if it is detrimental, if it is injurious to the host, we will call that outcome as a disease caused by that infectious microorganism. So now you should be clear, and whenever you speak something to a scientific people in particular, remember to use the right word at the right place. As you can see in this photograph, this boy, this child is having rashes on the surface. It is due to the infection caused by certain microorganisms, and it has been manifested as a kind of a disease. Now, what is a pathogen? Pathogen is a parasite causing infectious disease. When we use the word parasite, parasite means something which would damage the host. So pathogen is a parasite causing infectious disease. And there can be two different types of pathogens. First one is called primary pathogens. And these primary pathogens are the ones which causes infectious disease in healthy host. You will be able to understand it when we discuss what is opportunistic pathogens or a secondary pathogen. Opportunistic pathogen, as the name indicates, they differ from the primary one in a sense that they would cause the disease in compromised host. When I use the word compromised, what does it mean? Compromised means the one who is not strong enough. He is compromised in some sense. First, he may be immunocompromised. The person may be wounded. He might have lost he is a burn patient. He has lost the first line of defense, that is the skin. And he is prone to infection from the environment by many different microorganisms. His immune system is not functioning, or he may already be suffering from some disease, some infection, and there is another infection which would take place. Why? Because the person is already weak, the person is already sick. So such organisms who directly cannot cause any infections to a healthy individual unless and until that healthy individual is compromised. So those kinds of agents are known as opportunistic pathogens. And these opportunistic pathogens are normally, or I would say they can be the part of a normal flora. They can be the part of our normal body system. They can be the microbiome of a healthy individual. But under a healthy conditions, when the person is healthy, at that time, it cannot cause any disease. But when the host is sick, compromised, at that time, such disease, infectious disease, may take place. And that is why they are known as opportunistic pathogens. Next comes pathogenicity and virulence. We will just initially learn the definition of pathogenicity and virulence. Later in the chapter, we would discuss the virulence in more detail. So first is, what is pathogenicity? Pathogenicity is the ability to cause disease. And this is basically a genetic property of an organism, that an organism is pathogen. There are very few among the lot that microorganisms are pathogens. Otherwise, more than 80% of the organisms are non-pathogens, and we are safe with it. However, there are 20% or odd organisms which are pathogens. So, pathogenicity is the ability to cause disease. And this ability may vary among the pathogens. Now comes virulence. What is the virulence? Virulence is a degree of pathogenicity. Degree of pathogenicity, as it is indicated by, or as it is measured in terms of fatality rate, mortality rate, or you can say in simple words, the ability to damage the host tissue. How far, how seriously that pathogen is able to damage the host that is known as virulence. So it is a degree of pathogenicity. Remember this particular word. Virulence is a degree of pathogenicity. And it is indicated by fatality rate. Fatality rate means mortality. The severeness of a disease is indicated by morbidity and mortality. Morbidity means how many patients are or how many individuals are affected or suffering from that particular disease. And second, fatality or mortality. This basically is how many people die due to such infections. So when the mortality is very high, then it is an indication that the organism is highly virulent. So this is about pathogenicity and virulence. Now the infectious disease can be chronic or acute. The disease can be chronic or acute. What are chronic diseases? Chronic disease are persistent diseases. It means they last for long. It may last for months to years. And such diseases are known as chronic diseases. Chronic diseases takes a long time to begin, but once it starts, it progresses slowly and the person would recover also very slowly. And the period can be ranging from few weeks to few months. That is a chronic disease. Examples are HIV or AIDS. In contrast to these chronic diseases, we have acute diseases. Acute in a sense that there is a rapid onset and there is a rapid recovery. That is, in a short time, there will be an onset of the disease and there will also be a speedy recovery if the person does not die. For example, a common cold. It takes hardly a day or two to begin a dripping nose. The person may be feeling well in the morning, but by the time it's evening, he may be feeling certain uneasiness, headache, malaise, slight body temperature, and the dripping nose. These are the normal symptoms of a common cold, which may be caused by viruses. So the disease onset will be within few hours. And the person would also improve within few days. That is, common cold usually does not last for more than 2 to 5 days. The person would recover immediately. In contrast to chronic infections like, say, for example, TB or AIDS, it takes months to develop tuberculosis. And again, once it is there, once the person is infected, it would take many years of treatment. So this is about the type of infectious disease which we call it as a chronic and acute. Now the pathogen many times can enter a latent stage. So what is a latent stage? Latent stage means the parasite or that pathogen, it is present in the host but does not exhibit symptoms. What is the evidence? What is the proof that pathogen is there in the body? So naturally the symptoms will be symptoms or signs shown by the host would be the evidence. Whenever that pathogen is present, when it multiplies, establishes itself and obtains the nourishment, protection, everything from the host at the cost of the host within a few days, within few hours would start showing some symptoms or signs. So, in a latent stage, the pathogen is existing in a host's body, but it does not, there are no indications of it. The person himself feels he is fit and fine, though he is harboring that organism. Examples of such organisms includes herpes virus infections or tuberculosis, leprosy, chickenpox, that is varicella virus. All these organisms, they can remain in a latent stage for a long time, as you can see in this diagram in detail. Now coming to infectious disease process. What is this infectious disease process? How the disease progresses, how these organisms enter into the body, and what processes are followed later on, how the host would react to it in different stages. So this infectious disease processes typically characterize the infectious disease, and this characterization may vary from disease to disease. For example, normally it follows the 4 different stages. First one is incubation period, followed by prodromal stage. Third one is actual illness, and the fourth one is convalescent period. This can be illustrated in a simple graph. In this graph, which is shown here, this is x-axis and y-axis. X-axis is a time period, which you can consider it is either hours or even in a days or weeks. So this is a time period on a x-axis, and on a y-axis what we have is the intensity of symptoms, how powerful these symptoms are observed. The first phase, that is beginning from here, when the organism or the pathogen enters the host, that is 0 time, 0 minute. So from that time up to here, that is from the pathogen's entry to the development of first signs and symptoms in the host is known as incubation period. It is a time which is required for an organism to enter, to overcome the defense, start multiplication, start colonization, and ultimately start damaging the host. And when such damages would take place, the host would react by showing certain signs and symptoms. So that particular phase which is existing from here to here is known as incubation period. During this incubation period, the pathogen grows, it multiplies, but does not show any important changes in the host. No clinical manifestations are observed. That is incubation. Incubation means, now you can say, the actually time which is taken by the organisms before it shows the symptoms. The organism might have entered, probably in some cases years back or months earlier, and it has been able to survive and establish itself in the host's body for so many months. Not only, and when it is establishing, it is naturally, it is evading the host immune system. It is evading the phagocytosis, it is evading the cell-mediated immune response, and so on. So that is what we call as incubation period. Then next, second stage is prodromal stage. Prodromal stage is the one whereby the symptoms have developed just now or before few hours or days. However, one cannot conclusively or one cannot definitively say that it is due to this particular organism. It means clinical manifestations, signs and symptoms shown by the patients are insufficient for diagnosis. They are insufficient for diagnosis because most of the disease are of such that malaise, uneasiness, heaviness, headache, slight fever, all these things are very common. But unless and until the clinical manifestations are not there, we will classify as prodromal stage. It occurs after incubation period and before the period of actual illness. So this is a prodromal stage. Next in line, third, is the illness itself. Here the host would show most severe characteristic signs and symptoms. It means the disease is now well established. The immune response has also been triggered. And this is a period of actual illness. And probably this is the time where the patient feels or the person feels most uncomfortable. After this period, what you have is convalescence phase, or you can say convalescence period. What is convalescence? Convalescence is a phase whereby the recovery has slowly started. After reaching a climax or a peak where the person suffers the most, and because the symptoms were easily visible, the disease could be diagnosed by physician, or the diagnosis can be made by using various recent techniques and proving it conclusively that person is suffering from a disease. And this particular phase of illness may last for few hours to weeks to months. In acute disease, this will be of a short duration. In chronic disease, as we have discussed earlier, it may be for longer time. But once we are out of it, we have successfully passed that stage, we start recovering. The person would slowly start feeling well because he has been taking medicines, because he is being treated, and shows the recovery which is mentally as well as physical. The signs and symptoms which had reached to the peak from the bottom, from the prodromal stage during the phase of severe illness, those signs and symptoms would start declining slowly. So this is how there is a progression of a disease. How the disease progresses from the first stage, that is incubation period, prodromal stage, then what we have is a period of illness, and finally we have convalescent phase where the host would start slow recovery. Now coming to infectious chain. What is infectious chain? Infectious chain, it is basically an infectious disease cycle. And why we call it a chain? Because it involves a sequential combination of processes or events which are referred to as the infection chain. So infection chain is not one thing. It includes various steps. That is known as the infectious chain or an infection chain or a disease chain. These stages or these processes are linked with one another. The second one is linked with the first one. The third one is linked with the second one. As a result, it would establish a chain like this. See? In this chain, though it is very long, how many units are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6 units. They link together and form a chain. So that is what we call it as an infectious chain. And that was what the first title which was showing you was this chain. So what is it made up of? It is made up of pathogen. Then we have reservoir. Then we have portal of entry, means of transmission, portal of exit, and then from there again to the new host. And from a new host, the pathogen will again start going in this chain. So, in the host parasitic interactions, infectious chain, understanding the infectious chain is highly important. It is of paramount importance that we know the details of this chain. And if we know the details, then we can break that chain. And once the chain is broken, the transmission may be stopped. Transmission from healthy to the from the sick to the healthy individuals can be arrested. It can be stopped. So this is what we call as infectious chain. What are the components of this infectious chain? Components includes the pathogen source or reservoir. Reservoir means a location from where the pathogen would come. The host would pick up that pathogen from source or from a reservoir. Second one is transmission. And infectious dose. Minimum infectious dose is necessary for disease to develop. Then you have a growth rate. The growth rate of what? Growth rate of a pathogen. If a pathogen can multiply very rapidly, the damage can be very severe. That is called the growth rate of a pathogen. And then we have host susceptibility followed by exciting the host. Host susceptibility means the pathogen which has entered into a new host, will it suffer from the same disease as we have seen it in a spatulate? The requirement for a potential pathogen. Because from every disease, the causative agent should be able to isolate. It should be able to cultivate it on the laboratory. Then when the same pathogen is entered into a fresh host or a susceptible host, that susceptible host should show the same kind of symptoms as its preceders would show. And this is only possible if the host is susceptible. If host resists the infection, then the chain will be broken here. The chain would be broken. And finally, exciting the host. Exciting the host means the pathogen has to be released. It has to be come out from the host. It has to come out of the host and should be able to invade the new one. In this way, the entire cycle can be fulfilled. That is known as exciting the host. This is basically the chain of infection. If you remember this slide properly, then you will be able to write the detailed account of the chain of infection. Here, if we begin, then this is what the reservoir or the source is. The reservoir or the source can be any of these living individuals. From there, the organisms or what we call it as a pathogen or a germs would come out, and it would come out from the portal of exit. What are the different portals of exit? From mouth, from cut in skin, during diapering, that is during urination, and either going for a passing the ficus. That is when you want to relieve yourself. These are the ways by which these organisms comes out from the host. We throw them out. Or I would say pathogen tries to come out in order to sustain itself for a longer survival. This is the one. The diagram shows the defection of an individual in a latrine. Then from here, these pathogens which has come out must be able to reach successfully to the new host. That is the way of transmission. And this way of transmission can be either direct or indirect. We will be learning about those direct and indirect modes of transmission in detail at a later stage. Once the transmission has taken place and these pathogens have successfully reached to the new host, from there it has to enter into the host, and what we call it is a portal of entry. And the portal of entry can be mouth, it can be cut, or it can be through the inhalation of air. I told you 3 I's: inhalation, ingestion, and injection. Now once the organism through any of these portal of entry is successfully able to reach the host, new host I would say, there it should be able to establish. To do this, what is necessary is that the host must be susceptible. So it is maintaining the balance. If the host wins, the pathogen is eliminated. And that is possible if the host's immune system is able to overcome the pathogen. And vice versa. That is, if the pathogen wins, it will destroy the host immune system, or it would evade the host immune system in one way or the other, and would slowly multiply, grow, and colonize in the host. And once it is done, then the disease would begin. So this is the way in which the disease cycle would always keep on going. So that is what we call as chain of infection or the disease cycle. Now let us learn the each and every component of that disease cycle in detail. The first one is the source. What is source? Source means the location from where the pathogen is transmitted to the host. It is a location, remember, from where the pathogen is transmitted to the host. This source can either be animate or it can be inanimate. When I say animate, means living individuals, living entity. It can be human beings, it can be plants, or it can be animals and insects. So animated source of infections means those individuals who have been infected. Example, common cold, influenza, common cold. Suppose if I am suffering from a common cold and when I talk, cough or a sneeze, these organisms would be transmitted from me to the host, to the new healthy host. Similarly, zoonosis, it is basically among the animals. For example, in humans, it is transmitted. Example I have given you is common cold. In zoonotic diseases, that is among animals, it can be transferred from animal to humans. For example, rabies, dogs, monkeys, or through birds, for example, SARS, or through other smaller animals, arthropods. So that is animate. In inanimate, it can be soil, water, or food. Soil-borne fungal infections, for example, the presence of spores, various kinds of spores in soil, would be able to transfer fungi from that inanimate source to the new host. The point is, how does these organisms have reached that either soil, water, or food? Again, it has reached there from some diseased individuals in different ways, through portal of exit in those diseased individuals. For example, soil-borne fungal infections like aspergillosis, or water-borne diseases like amoebic dysentery. Now let us come to reservoir. These two things, that is the source and the reservoirs, are slightly confusing terms. Reservoir is an environmental location. Be careful. Source will always be either the human beings or the animals from where the disease comes to, from one human to another, and from one animal to another human being. That is from human to human and animal to human. So in that case, the source will be living things. That organism which causes the disease must come from already some source in which that individual, either human being or animal, was diseased. So that is the source. And reservoir means, in many cases, rather than directly coming from the source to the new host, the pathogen would rest for a while. You can say it would take a break, rest for a while in some environmental locations where such pathogens are normally found. Sometimes the reservoir can also be the source of pathogens. For example, the healthy human disease carriers of TB. Healthy human disease carriers of TB. I am using the word, be careful, healthy human disease carriers. This word is very important, carriers. Carrier is basically the term used for those individuals who harbors the pathogen, who carries the pathogen, but does not show any signs or symptoms of that disease. It means outwardly they appear to be healthy, but they do have that pathogen within them. Such individuals are rather more dangerous. Why? Because if you know that an individual is diseased, he is suffering from some disease, you would never take any steps in a way that it would infect you, or you would take all precautions to avoid the pathogen. You may visit the host, but then you may wear mask, you may wear PPE kit, and then you may serve him. You may go in his room to do certain services, to take care. And this is done because we know that that person is sick. But healthy carriers are normal individuals. They are potentially more dangerous. Though they harbor the pathogen, they do not give any indications. So such individuals are the healthy carriers. So reservoirs are sometimes the source of a pathogen itself, or sometimes reservoir and sources are different. For example, in case of Hendra virus, in case of this particular viral disease, the reservoirs are bats. And then from bat, the disease can be transmitted to human beings. For example, here in this diagram, it is shown that these two individuals wearing a PPE kit, they are feeding a horse, and it is a source of human infection. Horse suffering from some disease. So that is a reservoir. Now, second part is pathogen transmission. How these pathogens are transmitted. The transmission of pathogen means how the pathogen reaches from the infected individual to a new healthy host. The first scientist, physician I would say, was Ignaz Semmelweis, a very early phases of microbiology. We had referred this name when we were studying about the concepts of disease. During that lecture, we mentioned this particular physician who was first to demonstrate the occurrence of human to human disease transmission, and that was in the year 1848. Almost 170 years back. When people started understanding the role of organisms in causing the disease, he observed that in hospitals, the midwifery delivery, childbirth causing puerperal fever which was very common, a kind of a fever in female. And that was because, as you can see in the diagram, that so many nurses would attend to one individuals. From there, they would go to the second individuals without taking any precautions, without washing their hands. They would examine, they would serve multiple patients from one to second to third to next, like that. And thus, the organisms could be carried from first individual to another, next, from there to next individuals. He was the first one to say that there is a responsible agent which is causing such infections in hospital. And he also said that if a physician, nurses, ward boy, or the individuals serving in that hospital, as well as the instrumentations used for surgery, if they were washed with hypochlorite solutions, if proper sanitation practices like hand washing are followed, then this diseases could be prevented. It means the chain could be broken. The disease chain, infectious chain could be broken because transmission would stop. Joseph Lister was one of the first one to use phenol during his surgery, carbolic acid. Why he used it? Because he observed that many post-operative surgeries would be suffering from sepsis due to the contaminated instruments, contaminated hand, because physicians would use the same gloves and the same soiled hands in examining all individuals of that particular day. They found nothing wrong in it because the concept of organism was not there. Disease causing, that a disease is caused by microorganism was never existing because microorganism was never seen by anybody. Existence of microorganism was not there at all in those days. But then he said that if you take precautions, if you use your hand sanitation, hand washing techniques by use of phenol and carbolic acid and other things, then there would be a drastic reduction in such cases. So, initial transmission of a pathogen to the host is one of the most critical steps in infection chain. The pathogen has to reach to the host. That is what we call transmission. And the four most important modes of transmission are either airborne, direct contact, vehicles, use of certain vehicles. Vehicles means not the vehicles which we use for our, like motorcycle, car or other things. Here vehicles means other organisms. And vectors, insects. So these are basically the four modes of transmission. This diagram shows how the disease is transmitted and what are the different types. We will learn each of them in detail. For example, this is an infected individual. He is already suffering from some disease, means he is diseased. And this one is a healthy individual. From here, how the organism can reach here? For example, we say direct contact. The direct contact includes, say, here, first example of this is direct touch. Either it can be handshaking, or it can include kissing, it can include sexual transmission. These are basically the types of very common direct contact. Second one, by air. When the person would sneeze, cough, talk, microorganisms would come out from the mouth. This is the example of a virus here. By air. So when you talk, when you cough, micro droplets will come out from your mouth, and through air it would be inhaled by healthy individuals. Indirect contact means this person, infected person, is using a latch to open the door. His hands are already infected because while sneezing, he has used his hands here. When the person sneezes, he used hands. So these organisms have reached his hands. He uses the same bare hands to open the latch, to touch the book. And some other healthy individuals would again, after him, touch that same book or open that latch. Thus, by using the same inanimate objects, we would call them as a fomites, which we'll learn later on, that this is a kind of a indirect contact. Through this indirect contact, the healthy person may get infection. The organisms may get transmitted. Next comes by food. How the food is able to transmit? Suppose when we use meat, eggs, pork of infected individuals, then through that food, if it is not properly cooked, if it is not properly boiled, then through milk or through food, that is when we use contaminated water for preparing such food, then through food or water, such infections may reach the healthy individuals. Next comes insects. Here you can see the photograph of a mosquito. At present, today, in our city, there is a prevalence of dengue and chikungunya. Such diseases are transmitted by mosquitoes. They are viral diseases. Malaria is a protozoal disease. Chikungunya and dengue are viral diseases. They are basically transmitted through mosquito. So mosquito is a vehicle. We call them as a vectors. So here mosquito is also shown, and this is a mite or a tick, I would say. Tick, mite, louse, all these insects, arthropods, they are transmitting the organisms from an infected individual to the healthy individual. Mosquito examples are very simple. The mosquito feeds on a diseased individual. While taking the blood, sucking the blood, he also sucks certain parasites. It can be virus or it can be protozoa. And from there, it will fly to another healthy individual, bite him, and would regurgitate the saliva into that individual, thereby transmitting the organisms from a sick individual to a healthy. And through last one, as it is shown here, this is a dog which bites a man. It is a rabid dog. Through the saliva of this rabid dog, it bites the human individual. As a result, the organisms would reach through the wounds, through the bites. Saliva would reach to the healthy individuals, and the healthy individuals would be sick. He would suffer from rabies. So this is, I would say, a figure or a diagram which in short explains to you various modes of transmission of the disease. Okay. The details of this pathogen transmission, we would discuss it in a second part of our lecture of host-parasite relationship. So, for today's lecture, we have studied what is host, what is parasite, what are the different types of terms that we used, what is this disease triad, what are the necessities of a pathogen to flourish, and what the host would respond, how the host would try to overcome the pathogen, and how the pathogen would try to overcome the host immune response. The pathogen shows virulence, degree of pathogenicity, and there are various defense mechanisms which has to be overcome. First line of defense, second line of defense, the immune system, or what we call the resistance of organism in general, it has to overcome. Then we have also discussed about infection and disease. Infection means the presence and multiplication or colonization of the organisms in the body or outside the body, that is on the surface. It may not lead to disease because that kind of interaction can be beneficial too. But when the outcome is negative, when it damages the host, when it detrimentally affects the host's function, we will call it as a disease. We have also studied in detail about primary and opportunistic pathogens. And what is the difference between chronic and acute infections? Chronic infections would take long time to establish and would take long time to be cured, while the acute infection onset is very fast as well as the recovery is also very fast. What are the latent stages and what are the carrier stages? Clear? And finally, we also studied in detail the various stages of disease process: incubation period, prodromal stage, actual period of illness, and convalescent period. Last but not the least, we studied 6 different components of infectious chain: pathogen source or reservoir, transmission, infectious dose, the growth rate, and the host susceptibility, as well as how the pathogen would excite from the host. So these are the 6 different components of the infectious chain. We will be studying each of these components, including the transmission, in detail in our next lecture. Thank you very much.